33.9 kilometers of wall, not on land. Across the open sea, where the Yellow Sea pushes 6 meters of tide against the Korean coast twice every day. 6 meters. That is a 4-story building appearing and disappearing on a schedule that does not care what you are building. The southwest coast of Korea is not a coastline in any useful sense. It is a maze of tidal flats, shallow channels, and islands half submerged twice a day. At low tide, gray mud stretches to the horizon, soft enough to swallow a man to his waist. At high tide, brown seawater covers it entirely. Nothing visible, nothing solid. The water does not lap at the shore here. It arrives and departs like an occupation. In November of 1991, the South Korean government announced the largest maritime construction project in the country's history. A continuous embankment from the port city of Gunsan in the north to the headland of Busan in the south. 4 dike sections linking 3 chains of islands. 2 river estuaries blocked, the Saemangeum and the Dongjin. The wall would close off 401 square kilometers of the Yellow Sea, 2/3 the size of Seoul. The sea becomes a lake. The lake drains. The drained land becomes farmland and a freshwater reservoir. 400 square kilometers of new agricultural ground for a country where arable land is scarce. What the plan did not advertise is what the seafloor looked like. The southwestern coast sits atop millennia of tidal sediment deposited by those 2 rivers. Soft, saturated mud, unstable and compressible, running 20 meters deep in places before you reach anything that could be called a foundation. You cannot place a wall on tidal mud. The sediment liquefies under load. The structure tilts. The tide finds the angle and pulls it apart. The seabed does not support weight here. It absorbs it. And then there is the tide itself. 6 meters of tidal range twice a day means the current through any gap in a structure accelerates to speeds that turn construction materials into projectiles. Loose rock does not settle in a fast tidal channel. It rolls. Wire cages filled with stone get torn open. 10-ton boulders move downstream like gravel. The Yellow Sea is not a passive obstacle. It attacks the work twice every 24 hours on a schedule you can calculate but cannot negotiate with. The project divided into 4 dike sections, each growing from 2 ends toward a central gap, linking the 3 island chains between Gunsan and Busan. The finished structure would not look like a wall. It would look like a submerged mountain range. At its widest, the base would stretch 535 meters across, wider than 5 football fields. Average width 290 meters. Average height 36 meters with the deepest sections reaching 54 meters, from seabed to crest. Of those 54 meters, only 11 would show above the waterline. The rest, more than 40 meters, the height of a 12-story building, would sit permanently below the surface. You would drive across the Yellow Sea at 80 kilometers per hour, ocean on both sides, with no idea the road beneath you was taller than most apartment buildings in the city you just left. This was not a concrete wall. It was an earth embankment in the open sea. A sand core held between temporary retaining structures, armored on the seaward face with interlocking stone, capped on top with asphalt. Everything depended on the foundation beneath it, and the foundation was 20 meters of mud that the tide refilled every 6 hours. The estuary the wall would close had been worked by fishing communities for generations. Between 20,000 and 30,000 people harvested shellfish, fish, and seaweed from the tidal flats the embankment would bury. The migratory shorebirds that stopped here every spring and autumn, hundreds of thousands of them, flying between Siberia and Australia, depended on those same flats for the invertebrates that fueled 10,000-kilometer flights. None of that stopped the announcement. The government had done the arithmetic on agricultural land and freshwater supply, and the arithmetic came out in favor of the wall. What the announcement did not explain was how you build a wall in water that spends half its time erasing whatever you placed there 6 hours earlier. That problem, the engineering problem, the one that would consume 19 years and thousands of workers operating on 30-minute tidal windows in brown water, started the moment the first dredger anchored offshore and began eating the seabed alive. The first problem is not the water. It is what is underneath it. Before a single stone can be placed, the seabed has to be stripped down to stable clay. Cutter suction dredgers, floating factories with rotating cutter heads the size of cars, anchor offshore and grind the soft tidal mud into slurry. Slurry pumps through floating pipelines, hundreds of meters of steel pipe chained together on pontoons, to disposal areas behind the construction zone. Each dredger removes millions of cubic meters of material per month, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The low grinding roar carries for kilometers. It never stops. In some sections, the stable clay sits 20 meters down, 20 meters of unstable sediment to remove before a single stone can be placed. But the trench does not stay open. Every 6 hours, the tide reverses and deposits fresh sediment into the clean excavation, covering the exposed clay with a new blanket of mud. If the gravel foundation is not placed before the next tidal cycle, the dredging starts from zero. The crews work on tidal windows. 4 times a day, the current drops to near zero for roughly 30 minutes. Split hull barges loaded with 3,000 tons of crushed rock move into position during the slack. Hulls already opening as the current dies and dump the entire cargo in one release. Seconds to empty. Then out before the current returns. Miss the window and the consequences are immediate. In 1998, a timing error left 2 barges in the channel when the current turned. One grounded on the mudflat and listed until the next tide lifted it free. The other lost its anchor chain and drifted into the construction zone, striking a piling. The current does not give warnings. It simply arrives. The gravel bed has to be level. The dike above it weighs hundreds of thousands of tons per linear kilometer, uneven by centimeters, and the dike develops differential settlement. Cracks form. Seawater enters under pressure. The structure fails from inside, invisibly, while 401 square kilometers of sea waits behind it. Survey vessels cross and recross the trench, echo sounders mapping the gravel surface to centimeter accuracy. Where a section runs too high, divers descend and rake the stones flat by hand. 6 meters of visibility at best. Water cold enough to stop their fingers responding after 40 minutes. They level the foundation of the longest seawall on Earth with their hands. Divers on their knees in brown water, pushing gravel with their fingers. That is how this wall begins. The dike cross-section looks like a mountain on the seabed. Base width up to 535 meters. Average 290 meters. The core is sand. Millions of cubic meters pumped through floating pipelines into the rising structure, held behind temporary retaining walls of geotextile tubes. Giant fabric cylinders, each 30 to 50 meters long, inflated with sand slurry on site until they swell from flat cloth into solid sausages 2 meters in diameter, stacked in rows while the core drains and consolidates. 26 kilometers of geotextile tubes across the entire project. Each tube must be filled and pinned before the tide covers the work zone. Miss the window, and the rising water collapses the unfilled fabric. The sand core slumps into the sea. On the seaward face, a gently sloped embankment of riprap, each stone placed by crane to interlock with its neighbors. The slope absorbs wave energy by letting water rush up through the gaps and drain back without displacing anything. One stone washes out. The cavity undermines the stone above. That stone falls. The next follows. On the interface, compacted fill with a clay cap to protect the sand core from rainwater. On top, a 2-lane highway running the full 33.9 kilometers. At night, headlights move across the Yellow Sea like a road that should not exist. 2 sluice gate systems, Cincy and Garyock, sit in the southern section, controlling water exchange between the enclosed area and the open sea. Gates open, seawater enters. Gates close, fresh water from the Saemangeum and Dongjin rivers accumulates inside. These are not secondary infrastructure. They are the wall's circulatory system. If both systems fail during a storm surge, pressure builds on both faces simultaneously. The dike is designed for load from one side only. Simultaneous pressure from both sides exceeds its structural capacity. The sand core liquefies. The wall ceases to exist. The gates must work. Every time, in every storm, for as long as the wall stands. But none of this matters until the gaps are closed. The dike grows in 4 sections from both ends toward the center. As long as gaps remain open, the tide flows through twice a day. The estuary breathes. The moment a gap closes, the water that used to flow through it does not disappear. It has nowhere to go but the gaps that remain. And it accelerates. Watch what the physics does to a closing gap. The tidal volume does not change. 401 square kilometers of water still needs to move in and out of the estuary twice a day. When the first dike section closes its gap, that volume no longer has that opening to use. It forces itself through whatever gaps remain. Same water, less space. The current accelerates. Close another gap and it accelerates again. The relationship is not linear, it compounds. By the time only 1 or 2 openings remain, the current through them is not the same current the engineers planned against at the start of construction. It is faster, more violent, and it arrives on the same 30-minute tidal schedule that has governed every decision on this project for over a decade. This is the trap built into the design of every tidal closure in history. The closer you get to finished, the harder finishing becomes. The engineers tested the principle on the northern gap first. June 10, 2003. The northern section closes. The technique is not what most people expect. Instead of pushing material from one side to narrow the gap horizontally, they raise the entire seabed across the full width of the opening simultaneously. The gap does not narrow, it shallows. Less depth over the sill means less force acting on the fill material. The current still runs hard, but it runs over a rising platform rather than through a deepening channel. Hundreds of dump trucks line the dike crest. At slack water, the 30-minute pause between tides, every truck dumps at once. Rock, gravel, gabion bags. The sill rises centimeters per tidal cycle. Each cycle is a contest. Some loose stones roll and disappear downstream. Some bags shift, but enough holds. 1 centimeter higher than 6 hours ago. Wait for the next slack. Dump again. 1 more centimeter. Rock by rock, tide by tide. Not dramatic, just relentless. The northern gap closes, and immediately the current through the 2 remaining southern gaps increases. The water that used to flow through 3 openings now squeezes through 2. What was manageable becomes a different problem entirely. April 21, 2006. 2 southern gaps, each 2.7 kilometers wide. Both must close on the same day. This is not a preference, it is a structural constraint with no margin. If one gap closes before the other, the entire tidal volume of 401 square kilometers rushes through the single remaining opening. The current in that gap exceeds any constructible resistance. No rock stays at those velocities, no cage holds. The gap cannot be closed by any method available, which means that if the timing fails, the wall fails. One gap must not close before the other is ready. 0 exceptions. The operation begins at dawn. Convoys of dump trucks stretch back along both dike crests. Bulldozers idle at the edges. Mobile cranes sit on barges in the channels. Engineers on survey boats measure current speed in real time and radio adjustments to both fronts simultaneously. The tide drops 5 meters per second. 4, 3, the slack approaches. The signal goes to both fronts at the same moment. Hundreds of trucks dump at once. Rock cascades over the edge into churning brown water. Gabion bags tumble after, wire mesh sacks filled with a mix of rocks and smaller stones, each weighing several tons. This is the breakthrough the northern closure proved. Unlike loose rock, the bags hold together because the mesh traps the fill even when the current pushes hard. A loose boulder rolls away. A gabion bag 3 meters away holds its ground. Where a loose stone shifts, the bag beside it absorbs the load. The mesh is the difference between a wall and a ruin. The tide turns, the current reverses. Material that settled on the seaward face gets pushed from behind. The bags absorb the reversal. The sill holds. Next, slack. More trucks, more bags. The sill rises again. By evening, the water depth over both sills has decreased enough that the current can no longer move the stone size being used. The critical velocity threshold is crossed. Everything stays. Over the following days, crews raise both sills above the high tide line. Water stops flowing. For the first time in the estuary's geological history, the Saemangeum and Dongjin rivers are separated from the open sea. The current drops to zero. The wall is closed. On April 27, 2010, 19 years after groundbreaking, it opens officially. President Lee Myung-bak calls it the Great Wall on the Sea. In August of that same year, Guinness World Record certifies it as the longest man-made seawall on Earth. 33.9 kilometers, 500 meters longer than the Dutch Afsluitdijk, which had held the record for 78 years. 19 years. 2 decades of construction in water that attacked the work twice a day, every day, without exception. The wall stands because the crews matched the tide's relentlessness with their own, 30 minutes at a time, 1 centimeter at a time, until there was nothing left to close. The wall closed on April 21, 2006. The birds noticed before anyone published a study. Saemangeum was not an ordinary stretch of coastline. It was a critical refueling stop on the East Asian-Australasian Flyway, the migration corridor running from breeding grounds in Siberia and Alaska down to wintering grounds in Australia and New Zealand. Shorebirds flying that route cover distances that strain the limits of vertebrate physiology. 10,000 kilometers without meaningful rest. To do it, they need staging sites where invertebrate density in the mud is high enough to double their body weight in days. Saemangeum's tidal flats were exactly that. 29,000 hectares of productive intertidal mud, rich with the worms and mollusks and crustaceans that made the journey possible. Hundreds of thousands of birds stopped here every spring and autumn. Not because it was convenient, because without it, the math of the migration did not work. When the tide stopped flowing, the mud dried. The invertebrates that lived in wet sediment died. The food supply that had sustained a flyway vanished. Between 2006 and 2008, researchers counted what remained. At least 128,000 shorebirds lost from the site during that period. By 2014, the spring migration surveys recorded fewer than 5,000 birds at Saemangeum. Against the hundreds of thousands that had used the site before closure, that number is not a decline. It is an erasure. The species hit hardest were those with the fewest alternatives. The great knot and the red knot both used Saemangeum as a primary staging site. Populations of both collapsed in the years following closure. Satellite tracking data showed that the birds did not relocate to other mudflats along the coast. There were no other mudflats with equivalent food density within range. The birds that could not find sufficient fuel for the next leg of the migration did not complete it. They disappeared from the count, not because they went somewhere else, but because the survival equation stopped balancing. The Korean government had known this was coming. Environmental impact assessments were conducted. The ecological value of the tidal flats was documented. The findings did not change the outcome. What changed the timeline, briefly, were the courts. The Supreme Court of Korea halted construction twice. The first stop came in 1999. The second in 2005, 1 year before the southern gaps closed. Both times, environmental groups argued that the project violated Korean law protecting wetlands, and that the government had not adequately demonstrated the agricultural necessity that justified the destruction. Both times, the court ultimately ruled in favor of continuing. The project was too far advanced, the investment too deep, the political commitment too entrenched. Construction resumed after each halt. The gaps closed on schedule. The fishing communities had no court victories to point to at all. Between 20,000 and 30,000 people had worked the Saemangeum estuary for generations. Shellfish beds, fish spawning grounds, seaweed farms, all of it tied to tidal circulation that the wall ended on a specific day in April. Compensation was offered. It was disputed, delayed, and by most accounts of the people who received it, inadequate for what was lost. You cannot compensate a fishing family for the permanent end of the fishery that defined the work and the place, and the inherited knowledge of how to read a particular stretch of water. The money arrives. The sea does not come back. What makes Saemangeum's ecological cost distinct from ordinary industrial damage is the scale of the irreversibility. A tidal flat ecosystem that took thousands of years to develop, built from river sediment, shaped by tidal cycles, colonized by invertebrates over generations, does not recover when the tide stops. It does not pause and resume, it ends. The 29,000 hectares of intertidal habitat that disappeared in 2006 have not returned. They will not return while the wall stands. The mud is now dry land, or open water behind a dike, or the foundation of a road. The birds that depended on it had one migration season to find an alternative. Most did not. There is a word for what happened at Saemangeum that the engineering reports do not use. The reports use terms like habitat conversion and ecological impact and mitigation measures. The mitigation measures included plans for artificial tidal flats inside the enclosed area, constructed wetlands designed to partially replace the lost habitat. The birds did not use them at the scale the planners projected. Artificial substrate with controlled water levels is not 29,000 hectares of living intertidal mud shaped by 6-meter tides over millennia. The invertebrate density is not the same. The migration math still does not work. The wall cost around $2 trillion to build. That figure appears in the budget. The 29,000 hectares of tidal flat, the 128,000 birds counted as lost in 2 years, the fishing economy that ended the day the current stopped, none of that appears in the budget. It was paid in a different currency by people and animals who had no vote on the arithmetic. The original plan was simple. Drain the enclosed sea, farm the land, fill the reservoir. 400 square kilometers of new agricultural ground for a country that needed it. That plan did not survive contact with the 21st century. By the time the wall opened officially in 2010, South Korea's food import infrastructure had expanded. Domestic agricultural land was not the constraint it had been in 1991, and the political logic that had justified the project had quietly shifted. The farming vision that cost 19 years and $2 trillion to make possible was revised before a single field was planted. The reclaimed land would become something else. What exactly took another decade and a half to decide, and the deciding is still not finished. What accumulated in the meantime was investment. Accumulated investment in the Saemangeum development zone reached $16.4 trillion, a number that includes infrastructure, land preparation, planning, and the cascading commitments that follow when a government has staked that much on a piece of ground becoming something. The zone was granted Investment Promotion Zone status in June of 2023, opening it to fast-tracked foreign and domestic capital. Within months, anchor tenants began to materialize. The most significant is Hyundai Motor Group, which has committed to building an artificial intelligence data center and autonomous vehicle testing complex on reclaimed land. Construction is scheduled to begin in March of 2027, on ground that was tidal seabed within living memory. The site that was chosen for a data center processing the logistics of autonomous vehicles was, 30 years ago, mud flat, where migratory birds doubled their body weight before flying to Australia. In 2026, the development plan was revised again. The reclamation target was reduced from 240.5 square kilometers to 169.6 square kilometers, with a completion date set for 2035. The reduction reflects both ecological pressure and a more honest accounting of what the market can absorb. There is no point reclaiming land faster than uses can be found for it. One component of the revised plan is the smart waterfront city, 6.25 square kilometers designated for 25,000 residents, a mixed-use urban district built at the edge of the enclosed lake on ground that did not exist when the project was announced. This is what the wall produced. Not the thing it was built for, but something. Streets where there was sea, investment zones on former ocean floor, a data center on a mudflat. The transformation is real. It is also incomplete, contested, and still being negotiated between the version of the future the government imagined in 1991 and the version the world actually delivered. The full development budget, infrastructure, reclamation, industrial zones, the city, is estimated in the tens of billions of dollars. The wall itself cost around 2 trillion won, roughly $1.75 billion at the exchange rates of the construction period. That is the price of the structure. The price of the estuary it replaced is not in any budget, because no accounting system built for infrastructure projects has a line item for 29,000 hectares of tidal flat or the flyway that depended on it. What stands today is 33.9 kilometers of earth embankment in the Yellow Sea, 2/3 of it invisible below the surface, a 2-lane highway on top, ocean on one side, a lake on the other, and behind the lake, a construction site that has been under development for over 3 decades and will be under development for at least 1 more. The wall does not know what it was built for. It only knows what it does. It holds. Every day, the Yellow Sea presses 6 meters of tide against the outer face. The riprap absorbs it. The sand core holds. The sluice gates at Cincy and Garyok manage the water exchange between the enclosed lake and the ocean, keeping the pressure differential within the tolerances the engineers calculated. The wall performs exactly as designed. Whether it should have been built is a question the wall cannot answer. It was built. The sea it enclosed became land. The land became a construction site. The construction site is becoming a city. That is the transaction Saemangeum represents. Not a conquest and not a mistake. A choice made in 1991 with one set of priorities. Paid for over 19 years of tidal windows and gabion bags and court orders and dead birds, and still being redeemed on ground that the Yellow Sea has not forgotten it owns. The sea will take it back eventually. Not this year, not this century. But the maintenance schedule is forever, and forever is a long contract to sign in rock and sand on a coast that moves 6 meters twice a day.